Eleanor Barraclough is an historian and writer who explores the cultures of the medieval North. That is to say, the people who were part of the Viking Age. Now, surely something comes to mind for you when you hear Viking. As she says in her book, there's a lot of heavy lifting for the word. Maybe you're thinking about big, hairy invaders in longships with battle axes and adorned helmets. But Barraclough's latest book is about the everyday people of this world, not the raiders as much as the farmers and the kids. She sees history as fluid, like a river that flows and shifts with each turn. And these streams don't always have a clear beginning. In one chapter of the book, she offers 3 beginnings, including this one.
We're going to start with the beginning that actually takes us back several decades before what we think of as traditionally the start of the Viking Age. And it's an Agatha Christie-style murder mystery that involves a gaming piece that's been placed into the mouth of a dead man. And it's just the size of an apricot. It's made from animal bone, and there's a nail made of iron running through the top. This is a king piece from a board game that was popular in the Viking Age called Hnefatafel, which means fist table. And it was placed in the mouth of this young man, maybe somewhere between 25 or 35 years old. He died brutally. On his skeleton there are blade wounds on his bones of his arm and his hip. And he was buried in a ship, which feels like a very Viking way to be buried, except he wasn't alone. He was one of 34 dead men who had been carefully arranged in rows and buried together on this ship. 4 of them were brothers, and another one was possibly an uncle or a half-brother. So this was also something that affected generations of the same family. And we know their party had been attacked, and the sides of the boat had been shot with arrows that were still there. And they were covered, all of these bodies, with so many beautiful, precious artefacts, gaming pieces, combs and bear-tooth pendants, coloured beads made of glass and bone and enamel, and dogs that had been sacrificed to join their men in death, and also hunting birds such as hawks. But they were found in a place that we don't really think of as being part of that Viking Age story. They were found on the island of Saaremaa by the village of Salme, which is in Estonia. And they were also found buried from around 750 CE, which is almost 50 years before that first raid on Lindisfarne off the coast of northeast England. And so we have to start thinking about the Viking Age as something that's actually from a different time. It has different origins. It comes back further into time than we might think. And it faces east just as much as it faces west.
And there's a poem that is said to have been composed about one of these men's death.
Yeah, so this comes from a saga, and saga literally comes from the Old Norse word segja, to tell. It's about a king called Ingvar, who's described as a great warrior, often out on warships. And the story goes that one year in the summer he's out defending his lands against attackers from the Eastern Baltic and from Denmark, but he's defeated by locals when he's raiding around Estonia. And so a poem is then composed about his death, and this poem includes the lines, "The host of Estonians slew the leader, the light-hued one, and the eastern sea sings the lay of Gymir to cheer the fallen king." We're not saying that the man who's buried with the king piece in his mouth is definitely King Ingvar, but history has a way of bending itself out of shape as it makes its way down the centuries. For over 1,000 years, the Eastern Sea has sung the lay of Gymir to the unnamed fallen men, its music drifting across the waves and onto the ever-expanding shoreline of this Estonian island, which grows thicker with age. The song curls through the slender trees and grass towards the ships and their precious cargo, buried long ago with such care. The cheerful tang of salt on the breeze would have reached them all, the leader with his stiff neck, the 4 brothers and their uncle, the sacrificed hawks and dogs, and the gaming pieces scattered over the bodies, cradled in a lap, placed in a mouth. And then, just at that moment when it feels as though someone is calling out to us from the past, almost close enough to hear them whisper over the sound of rattling waves, they're gone once more, vanished back into the past.
This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Eleanor Barraclough's new book is called Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. She says when you work through the pottery and the tools and the graffiti and the runes, you can reconstruct something of the lives of the people of the Viking Age, how they loved and played, what they believed. We began our conversation with her image of history, a great untamed river.
I remember being at school and history was fine, but I always felt like I wasn't able quite to get a handle on it, because the question I always wanted to know was, well, what happened before that point, or what happened next? And, there always seemed to be this sense of, these are the facts that we need to know. And usually those facts and the dates are related to the people at the top of the pile, and they're usually kings. Yeah, so it always felt, slightly artificial, because that wasn't my experience of being in the world. I thought this can't be the experience of anyone being in the world. And then, you get a bit older and a bit more confident in your own thoughts. And at that point, I started to think, no, there's something else going on here that I can get a handle on. Partly because you almost can't get a handle on it. It's the, it's the places between the certainties that I found so fascinating. Those were the bits where the humanity seemed to sit. And so then if you take away that certainty and you take away, obviously you need dates, you need characters, you need figures, of course you do. But if you take away that as that sort of overarching essential framework, then you start to get down into the humanity and that sort of churning sense of those waterways that run underneath that experience of sort of humans being in the world.
You write about there's this question you ask in the book, where do we begin, with a history of the Viking Age? And so you go way back, like 2,000 years ago, almost, to this Danish bog. Do you want to set that scene for us? This sort of beginning point that you write about, and what they found there that tells us about the lives of these people who will come to be known as I guess, as Vikings, although we'll talk about that word too.
Yeah, so Vimose is a bog. It's a Danish bog. And really the story takes us back to the 1st century BCE, so when Rome is still very much in its infancy. And so the idea is that people started to sacrifice items. And what we find in Vimose from around the year 160, it's a little comb. And what we have over the top of the comb, on that sort of arching handle that you will hold, is a series of runic letters. And they're the earliest runic letters that we can read. And they spell out a word, harja. Now, the problem is we don't really know for certain what harja means. It might just mean comb, but that word har might also be something to do with warfare. It might be a word that basically means army. It might be someone's personal name that just happens to have a military root, or it might be it might refer to a people, who are essentially called the Hari. So we don't know, but the fact is that's the earliest time that we see runes. that we can decipher. And so for me, that's a wonderful moment. Not to, obviously, you're not going to situate the start of the Viking Age there, but maybe you situate a seed that will grow into the Viking Age in this bog. And of course, it comes back to this metaphor of history as river, as water, as something that's fluid and moving. And so I found that there were some ideas that just kept on coming through the book. And one of those was water. One of those was just that sort of fluidity and movement and power of the water.
Well, the other thing about the comb, which we should say is on the cover of the book, if people want to see it, is that it was one of those physical remains of this high, as you say in the book, highly personal, everyday ritual. And I guess that also represents in some way what you're getting at in the book, exploring the not so much just the grand story of the high profile Vikings, but the everyday ones, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I started to think, well, okay, if I can almost, gather into my story of the Viking Age all these different fragments of humanity, well, that's the story I actually want to tell at this point in my life. This is the story of humanity and all its little, the little bits, the detritus, and that comes, so Embers of the Hands. I often get asked, well, what does that mean? It's a slightly strange title. Well, Embers of the Hands is what we call a kenning, which is sort of, almost like a cryptic crossword clue. So it's Old Norse poetry is really complicated, and they don't like to make it easy. It's almost like the whole thing is like a cryptic crossword. You have to sort of, particularly skaldic verse, which is where kennings are found, and you have to sort of make your way through it, and all the words are jumbled up, and it's absolutely horrible. But a kenning is sort of like an extended metaphor, really. It's a way of describing something that might be quite ordinary, by making it poetical or fantastical, referring it in reference to one thing that then links to another thing. And so within that context, Embers of the Hands is, well, at least it was initially, it's in its original context, it's a kenning for gold or treasure, something that you hold in your hand and it sparkles and it glows. But what I wanted to do was essentially take that kenning and make it something that was every bit as precious, so it's something you hold in your hand. And we go back to the combs, that preciousness of an individual, of a life. It doesn't matter how long or short that life was, just something that you hold in your hand. Okay, it's not literally sparkling, but that sense of a value that isn't about the treasure and the big hitters. It's something so much more tangible.
Let's get a basic question out of the way, and that is the term Viking. You say as a term, it sort of disappeared for a very long time and then reemerges in the 1800s. Yeah. But in one review of your book, an historian was quoted who said that it's not, Viking is not an ethnic label; it's a job description.
Yes.
Yes. Is that right? And what should we say about the idea of about the term?
Yeah,
Viking?
So that's exactly right. Initially, Vikingur, which is the Old Norse noun, just means raider, and there's a verb version. So you basically go on a Viking, you go on a Viking, which is a raid, a summer raid, basically. Nothing more than that. There's an Old English form of the word, so that existed in, what we might call the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that are around the same time. So we're talking sort of 8th century. At least this term first appears. And the Old English version is weeching, which just means pirate. So absolutely, when we're talking about the Viking Age, we have to, in its sort of most black and white terms, it just means the age in which people from Scandinavia, because it has become known as associated with that, were raiding.
Well, one of the things you mentioned is the Vikings were never full-time raiders.
No.
And it kind of gets us to that the everyday lives of people.
Yeah.
This was interesting. You say so they were farmers. I mean, at least farming, you say, was by far the most important occupation for these people at a certain time. It was the foundation, you say, for everything.
Yeah, absolutely that. So, and depending on where they are, obviously there's sort of the balance of what they are doing alongside agriculture and what they're able to do agriculturally, that's going to shift a bit. So to take the North Atlantic as an example, they always seem to take out, I think it's almost like a sort of blueprint for the ideal farm, where cows are sort of top of the pecking order and pigs are great. Sheep and goats, well, they're fine, we'll bring them anyway. And then they try and sort of grow what they can in terms of crops, barley, oats. But depending on where they take this blueprint out, of course, it changes over time. So, for example, the Faroe Islands, great. Pigs, brilliant. There are, I think it's over 100 Norse place names on the Faroes that are pig related, because pigs seem to have had a lovely time. I read somewhere that they're just basically gorging themselves on buttercups out in the Faroes, which I love. Wow. But by comparison, when you get to Greenland, you're right on the edge of that farmable land. You're in the margins of what you might think of as a sort of northern European medieval agricultural society. And so they do farm where they can, and there are fertile pockets. But suddenly, what really matters are these sheep and goats that they've brought out, because it turns out they're incredibly hardy, and pigs tend to die off. So, don't worry about the pigs anymore. And then cows are sort of the prestige. The word for cattle is the same as the word for wealth. It's that word fie. But what they also have to do is a lot more hunting. And so they have to adapt each time. And that's the wonderful thing. I mean, this is a culture that's extraordinarily adaptable, both in terms of the different landscapes in which they find themselves, but also the different cultures in which they find themselves sort of embedded.
Eleanor Barraclough, she's an historian and broadcaster for the BBC. Her book is Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. We'll take a break, come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Today in the program, the historian and BBC broadcaster Eleanor Barraclough is with us, talking about the people of the Viking Age. She's written about the adventurers and the raiders. This time, she's shifted her focus to daily life, which she says you can uncover by sifting through artifacts like their gaming boards and their doodles and their combs. The book is called Embers of the Hands. One of the things you write about is the cultural fluidity of this time. That was an important thing. And the sort of practical aspect of Viking travel. But let me ask you about maybe the abstract idea of movement, which you've talked about, that's important for understanding these people as well. What about just that impulse to explore? Is that there too for these people? I mean, beyond the basic incentive to make a living, do they also want to venture out?
Yeah, I think they do. There does seem to be this sort of cultural sense of this is a good thing to do and you will be praised for doing it. So some of our evidence for that comes from the sagas. As I say earlier, oral origins for these sagas, but sort of written down in the 13th century onwards. But when they get to the edge of North America, for example, the first, according to one of the sagas, the first person to sight land there is a sailor called Bjarni, who's essentially been blown off course. And he doesn't land. And when he then gets back to Greenland, everyone says, "Oh, it's a bit funny that you didn't want to land." So it's this sense of, oh no, that's not what you do. That's not a noble thing to do. You go and explore. But then we also, we started with the Salme ships, these burials, mass burials in the ship and the boat, in the island of Saaremaa, Estonia. And that's a really interesting one because they're killed violently. but it doesn't look like they're on a raid at all. So not least because they're surrounded by these incredible grave goods they're buried with, these gaming pieces, and they've got hunting dogs, they've got birds of prey. You don't take any of those things on a raid. And so what archaeologists think is going on here is essentially they're trying to create diplomatic links, perhaps, with the East. They're trying to open up trading routes. And so that's a reflection of this sense of adventure, this sense of connections and going forward and meeting other cultural groups, whether sort of violently or diplomatically. That's a good thing. That's something you should do.
One of the things that you mention is this Norse ship graffiti, basically. And there's this outline of a foot that is scratched out on these planks of wood on a particular ship. What does that tell us about? There's a lot of graffiti, it seems, in this Norse culture.
Yes.
What does this tell us about their inclinations for travel, or the fact that they did travel, or that they were good at navigation and ship technology? What does that graffiti tell us?
Oh, I love this graffiti. It's one of my favourite things. So it's literally, it's the outline of a right foot, and it's sort of split across two planks of wood. Whoever's done it has even added in their little toenails, which for me is sort of it's such a touching little detail. What's interesting though is that it's really quite a small foot. So it's sort of the average 10-year-old today, something like that. Yeah. And so the suggestion is this is maybe not a 10-year-old, because people were a little bit smaller, but, maybe it's a teenager, maybe it's someone on their first sort of voyage, and they're bored. And so they're just doing this on this magnificent seagoing warship. And it's a ship burial. And the person who was buried in it is a warrior. He's a leader. He's someone who, dies violently, probably in battle, and is buried with all his grave goods. So in terms of what this tells us about travel, on the one hand, we're right at the top of the pile. We've got this phenomenally well-crafted elite longship that's then used for a elite burial. But then on the other hand, we've got, the little bored toes outline of someone who might well have been the most junior member of the crew. And it's this sense of these macro and micro narratives that are sort of coexisting within the historical story.
Talk to us about the religious worldview of the people of the Viking Age, although they wouldn't use the word religion. You say that this was a world in which the concept of supernatural forces didn't really have any meaning, because gods and spirits, you say, they were just threaded throughout their material world. So what was their sort of cosmological worldview? No, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's a very important point you make about they didn't really have a word for religion. There's a word siður, which means sort of custom, but religion as that sort of organized entity, we have to sort of put that idea aside. So the cosmology, now again, we know this predominantly because it's written down in 13th century Iceland. There's two really important texts, or one text that we have quite a few manuscripts for, and another we only have one manuscript for. And the first of these is written by Snorri Sturluson, who also wrote the collection of king sagas called Heimskringla. Snorri says that, in the beginning there is the void, Gingungagap, this eternal, endless void. And then on one side you have a world of fire, and on the other side you have a world of ice. And where the icy rivers sort of trickle down towards the fire and they start to melt, you have the beginning of creation. And the first being that's formed in this primeval void is an ice or a frost giant called Ymir. And the story goes that eventually Ymir is murdered, and his body becomes the world as we know it. So his skull is set up as the sky, and his blood becomes the rivers and the seas, and his bone becomes the rocks, the stones. And that's the beginning of the world. Well, one of the things you say in the book is that, so in Islam or in Christianity, and we'll get to Christianity here in a second, but you say those faiths, like the monotheistic faiths, involve quote-unquote true beliefs or correct behavior.
Yeah.
But the early Norse belief was different. Explain how so.
Well, it's a very interesting one, and I always feel a bit sorry for the pagan Norse in this respect, because so they're it seems to be, we've got to be again careful with the sources that we've got, but it's like, hey, the more the merrier. Everyone's invited to this party. So when we get the we get sort of like Christian ideas coming in, we get missionaries, sort of 9th century, but we also get the fact that there are enslaved people who have been taken, for example, from Britain and Ireland, who bring their beliefs about Christianity into the Norse cultural sphere. And if they're the mothers of the children that are born with Norse men, then that's going to become a very important part of the cultural memory being passed down. So even when there's no sort of official conversion to Christianity, those ideas are there. And what you see in the sagas is, they'll describe a character saying, I don't know, things like he prayed to the white Christ when he was on land, but of course he prayed to Thor when he was at sea. But it's the fact that for the Norse, there's a flexibility there, and there's different scales of belief and attachment to these, as we might call them, but as you say, it's, they wouldn't necessarily think of them like this, these sort of supernatural entities within the world. So you have, you might have kind of the major, we might say, gods and goddesses that we know today, people like Freya and Thor, Odin, Loki. But then there are personal spirits. There are, for example, the Filia, which are sort of the kind of followers, these they're almost like your own personal spirits or your family spirits, that are passed down the generations that guard you. And then you have the Landvættir, literally the sort of the land creatures, the guardian spirits of the land. And you might there have, a creature that lives in the local mound, and you might leave offerings to it, or they might come into your home and, you need to keep them on side. So I love that way of thinking about it. There's a lot more flexibility in that system than compared to sort of converting religions such as Christianity that can't, by definition, almost have room for sort of beliefs that are other.
You have a chapter on love, and there's this scenario you imagine based on some evidence that I want you to talk about. And I guess the setting is a bar or a tavern.
Yeah.
And as you write, someone inside is getting very drunk, but back home, someone is getting very cross. Yes. Tell us this story, because I guess this is another piece of graffiti or writing?
Well, exactly. So we're back with our friends, the runes. Rune means something like secret, hidden, but by the time we get to this bar, it's in Bergen in Norway, and we're around the year 1200, so everyone's basically using these runes, but they're using them essentially sort of like post-it notes or text messages, something like it's just scribbles, and it's not meant for posterity. And this is why they're so wonderful, because a huge cache of them were found. It was in there was a fire in Bergen at Bryggen in the old harbour back in the 50s, and the archaeologists were sent in and they found all these things. And again, it's like Vimose or the glaciers, the ice in Norway. They preserve this wonderful body of sort of organic material as evidence that would usually not survive its sort of anaerobic conditions. And there's I think it's over 700 of these runic inscriptions. And they're mostly on bits of wood, there's bone, metal, and this is one of them. And it just says, I just love it so much. It's a piece of wood. It says, Gyða says, go home. And Gyða is the name of a woman. It's sort of in Old Norse transliterated, so it's Gyða segir að þú kak heim. But what's even better, so Gyða has basically sent a message down to the pub telling someone inside to come back. And again, we have to fill in the gaps. We have to be careful. This isn't sort of absolutely the case, but I love the fact that on the other side, there's another message being scribbled in runes, except it's completely unintelligible. You can't read anything. And so in my head, that's the equivalent of, when you send a drunk text message basically back from, I'm on my way, it's absolutely fine. It's nothing. So it's one of my favourite nubbins about it. We talk about these embers of the hands. There's nothing like this. It's like you can feel the emotion, the pissed offness, as we'd say, the anger just radiating off this message that she sent. But also, I rather love it because we can't say for sure that this is a woman's hand carving this. But we have other examples like that where we know the name of the carver because the sort of convention of how you write it is so that basically you I so-and-so, blah, 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 or like Geetha says you should go home. So there's a good chance that this is Geetha writing this. And we have plenty of other runic inscriptions, many from Bergen in this harbour, that are written by women. And that's also wonderful because it's this window into a major, it's like, over 50% of the population, it's female. And yet it's so hard to find those stories. And as a historian and a writer, it's also so hard to make those stories compelling on their own terms because you know what it's like, sort of, particularly with something like the Viking Age, you're drawn in for the drama. And you don't want to then say, right, okay, that's all rubbish. I'm now going to talk to you about weaving for 200 pages, because I wouldn't want to read that book. So it's finding ways to make those female activities and those female spheres and other spheres, not just female, obviously, but that was a big challenge, the female one, make it interesting, bring those women back to life as well, on their own terms, rather than basically just turn them all into shield maidens.
Eleanor Barraclough. Her book is Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. Take another break, come back in a moment. You're listening to Radio West. This is Radio West. I'm Doug Fabrizio. Back now to our conversation with the historian Eleanor Barraclough. We're talking about her book, Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. So there's a section on bodies that I want to ask you about, and we have to talk about Viking hair care, because you say, here's how you write this in the book, hair care isn't the first thing that springs to mind when you're picturing those who lived during the Viking Age, but it's a far more accurate representation of the culture than horned helmets.
Yes.
So talk about, I guess, the way they present. They were fastidious about their hair, at least in certain eras, right? And there's this reference to being bared neck and blinded eyes. And good hygiene, it seems like, or at least during some periods. They bathed on Sunday. So talk about the bodies part of the story.
Yeah, so the grooming regimes of the Vikings, I love, because, as you say, it's so different to what we would think of. And from the point of view, certainly, of sort of the Anglo-Saxons in England, sort of broadly defined, those kingdoms, we have so many fantastic texts written by angry sort of locals who are really cross because these incoming Scandinavians are so clean and well groomed and sexy and nice smelling. And then later on, by around the year 1000, we've got Scandinavians settling in, all around Britain, various parts of Britain, but in this case in what becomes known as the Danelaws. So, sort of the kind of middle part of England and then going up north. And so they're very much becoming part of the cultural story of England, as well as sort of, they're not just raiders who kind of hit and run, come in and out. And so around the year 1000, there's an abbot called Alfric, and he's called Alfric of Aynsham, which is sort of quite close to Oxford. And he sends a letter to someone called Edward, and he addresses Edward as brother. And you might, now we don't know, so you might think, oh, well, that, a religious brother, except Edward, it seems, doesn't have the sort of tonsure that you would expect from a man of the cloth at this time, because Abbot Alfred is really cross at Edward. So now I'm thinking, okay, is he just his brother? And he's like, Edward, seriously? Because Edward seems to be copying the Scandinavian settlers, and particularly their hairstyles. And so, I've got it here, I can read it because it's brilliant. So he says, I also say to you, brother Edward, now that you have asked me for this, so obviously there's a letter that's been sent to Alfred, that you do wrong in that you abandon the English customs which your fathers observed, and love the customs of the heathen people who did not give life to you, and by doing so you reveal that you despise your kindred and your ancestors by such evil customs. And here's the bit where you dress in insult to them in Danish fashion with bared neck and blinded eyes. And so it's basically short at the back and long and shaggy at the front. And I love this because he then goes on to say, oh, by the way, can you tell the local country women that they shouldn't be eating on the privy? They shouldn't be eating when they're on the toilet. But for him, the most important thing is don't cut your hair like a Scandinavian. And sort of 200 years later or something, even more actually, someone is writing looking back at this time, and he's called John of Wallingford, and he basically says, one of the problems with these incoming settlers from Scandinavia is that they combed their hair every day and they bathed every Saturday and they changed their clothes and they basically tarted themselves up. They all looked wonderful, and as a result all the local women thought they were absolutely wonderful and they were attracted to them rather than the local men. But what's wonderful is that he mentions them about the fact that they bathe on Saturdays, and that it's still in the in the language. So the Old Norse word for Saturday is laugedagur, which means sort of bath day or wash day, and that's still there. In modern Norwegian, it's lørdag. So it's this idea that that is the day where you bring the hot water out, you do the washing. So there's always this sense of grooming regimes, and you will know them by their excellent hair. But of course, that's from a sort of English perspective. We have other sources written about, I think we might say, people of Scandinavian heritage or descent, because although this group starts off being sort of Scandinavian, there's a bigger Slavic context, culturally speaking, that they become part of very quickly. So this is then, we're going down the Volga. So we're very much, out in the east. And there's a diplomat from Baghdad called Ibn Fadlan. And he's coming up the Volga because he's part of a diplomatic party being sent to convert the king of the Volga Bulgars to Islam. But he meets on the waterway a group that he calls the Rus. And the Rus seem...
He's disgusted by them.
He's absolutely disgusted, but for good reason. So, oh my goodness. So he describes, I don't even like saying it, he describes how they wash in the morning. And basically, a girl comes around with a big bowl full of water, and they just pass the water around, and they clean their beard into it, and they snot into it, and they spit into it, and they just pass it on to the next person. It's absolutely horrible. And of course, Ibn Fadlan, is coming from, a Muslim Islamic context where you bathe in running water, and and he's saying, they I can't remember, he says it politely, but basically, after they have sex, they don't wash. It's absolutely, so you can almost hear him gagging as he's writing this down. So from his point of view, they're absolutely filthy. And that always makes me think, well, oh my goodness, what were the Anglo-Saxons, what were the English like if they thought... no wonder the women were all just like, no, we'll stick to the sexy Scandinavians with their clean socks, please.
I wanted to ask you about what seems to be your kind of fascination with this facial reconstruction of people, the Norse. Because one of the things you write about in the book is the difficulty in conjuring up their faces. And there's this great photograph from this exhibition from the National Museum of Denmark, where we see this, not a warrior, like an everyday farmer, dressed really simply. And I don't know, say something about just the difficulty of conjuring up their faces and imagining just what they look like.
Yeah, so when I was sort of, young teenager, there was this amazing program in the UK called Meet the Ancestors, where they'd essentially reconstruct faces, partly computer generated and certainly more now, but also just sort of working out, okay, so that's where that bone is, so how much muscle would be on top of that? Okay, that's how old that skeleton is, so how much, sagging would there be? And this, for me, I was entranced. I just remember every week waiting for this program because I wanted to see the faces of the past. And you mentioned this one in Copenhagen. Now, this was this amazing exhibition, on the Viking Age called KUER, so the Raid, which was there. I did a road trip all the way across Europe, to see this exhibition was the end point with my my two very young children. They were like 2 and 3 at the time. So there were so many incredible things to see there. But one of the most sort of incredibly touching and wondrous to look at were these two skeletons side by side in the case. And one was the body of a young man, and he had been found in Oxford in England in a mass grave from just before around 1000 or something, and he'd been violently killed. And then there was this huge DNA study that was done in 2020, and people were finding that these bodies that had been dug up, over the years, were connected in all sorts of ways that they didn't expect. And this was the most extraordinary of them, because there'd been another body, another skeleton that had been found, I think on the island of Fyn in Denmark, from around the same time, an older man, maybe in his 50s, and he had died, there had been some violence in his life and his death, but it wasn't the sort of horrible execution that we see in the younger body. But it turns out that they were what we say is second degree relatives, so an uncle and nephew perhaps, or half brothers, or it's absolutely extraordinary that these two bodies, we know at least the genetic connection between them. And so they were brought together for this exhibition. Now, the younger man who died in Oxford didn't have enough of his face remaining to reconstruct, but the older man did. And so they so I say brought him back to life, obviously not really, but it really felt like that. I've never seen such an incredible reconstruction. And I don't want to say he was a warrior, we don't know, but he knew violence in his life. But he's there as a farmer, and he's holding an apple, and he's got a little knife for peeling or coring, and he's balding, but he has this kind of like longer hair coming down the back, and he's got maybe 3 days worth of stubble. But my favourite feature is his fingernails, because they're dirty. This is the presentation of an individual, as you say, as a farmer, as someone who works the land, as someone who, by the standards of the time, lived to a pretty decent age. And it's the expression they've given his face. It's knowing, it's wistful, it's and that, of course, is the artistry. You can't reconstruct facial expressions, but I remember that was almost more than anything else, all these like incredibly famous artifacts. As a historian, you're desperate to see. You've never seen sort of in the flesh, as it were, and yet I just couldn't stop going back to him, just staring at him. There was just something so captivating about being literally sort of in a way being brought face to face with someone from the past.
You mentioned your kids, so it's a good segue into play. That's one of the chapters.
Yes.
And I think, just tell us about, I don't know how to pronounce the name, Onfim?
Oh, little Onfim, yes.
Onfim.
It's all right. This is one where his name is Slavic, so you are as likely to be correct as I am, and I'm sure people listening will have much better ideas. But yeah, Onfim is what I say. Yeah. Oh, Onfim's wonderful. Now, we have to go east to Onfim, to Novgorod, so in what's now Russia, and the important thing to note is I've mentioned a couple of times that although the story of sort of Scandinavians looking east, in a way, seems to have started even earlier than the story of Scandinavians looking west, there is this sense. So there's a character called Rurik, and he is said to come from Sweden, and he sort of settles in Novgorod in sort of the late 800s, in the 860s, and he basically founds the dynasty, the Rurikid, that become the rulers of this sort of this polity, this cultural group that becomes known as sort of Kievan Rus. Now, it becomes known as Kievan Rus because although it starts in Novgorod, their power base sort of shifts to Kiev a couple of decades after Rurik. Now, by the time we get to Onfim, we're talking around 1300 or so. This is very much past that point. 400 years or so. And by that time, that little sort of drop of Scandinavian culture, it's not that it's disappeared, but we have to see it within the much more dominant context of sort of the Slavic cultural groups in particular who were living in that part of the world. And so by the time we get to Onfim, we're not talking runes. He's not writing in runes. He's writing in sort of Cyrillic script, and his name isn't Norse. But what's a lovely sort of side thing is that there is still sort of Norse echoes in this culture. So you have names into the sort of the 14th century that are Norse in origin. It's just they mean something else then. Now, Onfim is one of many, many, many people sort of from Novgorod who is writing on birch bark. And, we've mentioned various contexts in which this amazing organic material survives for us to sort of peer into the past. And this is another example because Novgorod was extremely boggy, and there's I think it's an Arabic writer who talks about Novgorod sort of at its Nordic height, and he says it's like pestilential and it's squelchy underfoot, but this does mean that birch bark as a writing surface survives incredibly well, and so we have hundreds of these documents, and they're mostly adults, and they're mostly things like their letters or their legal things, or their, please send this and this and this, or they, but within them we have Onfim, and Onfim is the would we say the artist, but also the author, because they're written ones of, maybe, I don't know, a good handful, a dozen, but that sort of number of these birch bark pieces of writing and drawing, and he's clearly in what we think of as a schoolroom. He's just writing, and he's getting bored. So we're back to this idea of the foot being carved onto the planks of the Viking ship. This is just like human boredom and childlike boredom, where he's so sweet. He'll draw him and his school friends sitting at their desks with the teacher at the front of the classroom, or at one point he draws himself, and we know it's himself because he writes it. He's a fire-breathing beast, and he draws this little thing, and then he writes, "I am a fire-breathing beast. I am a beast," I think he says. And then we know he's drawing this as a present to his friend, because he says, a bow from Onfim to Danilo. So Danilo is his friend who's lucky enough to get this drawing. But then there are others, and it's incredibly touching. I sometimes find it quite hard to write about these things because it almost feels too close to the bone. It's almost too raw in its humanity. You have these pictures where he's drawn himself as what looks like a warrior, and he's next to a much bigger warrior, and I always think, is that him and his dad? Is that him and his big brother or something? He's a mini-me warrior. And then there's another one that I talk about in the book, and it's not one of the, some of them are hilarious. It's, him on horseback trampling his enemies into the ground, or, advancing on his enemies, and the enemies looking absolutely terrified. It's really funny. It's so relatable. But then there's another one where it's been broken off. The edge of so we can only see one of the figures, and it's a little figure, and it's holding out its hand, and then all we see from the bit that's been broken off is another figure, higher up, taller, adult, holding out their hand to touch Onfim's. And for me, that one image encapsulates everything I was trying to do in this book, not least the gap between the hands, because that's really important to remember. And I think it's not something to sort of be sad about remembering. It's just something to acknowledge that there is always going to be that space in between. There's this fundamental unknowability about the past, and yet we can still reach out our hands, to almost touch the people who lived before us, in the same way that, one day maybe other people will reach out their hands to us.
Eleanor Barraclough, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Eleanor Barraclough. Her book is Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. Radio West is a production of KUER. You can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. We're on YouTube at KUER 90.1. We're on Instagram at Radio West, or you can just email us at radiowest@kuer.org. Our intern is Katrina Cano. The program produced by Benjamin Bombard and Tim Slover. Carrie Watson is our executive producer. I'm Doug Fabrizio.